In my family, love was a performance review, and I had been failing it for years. My father ran Whitmore Capital Partners out of a corner office on the 32nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Dallas, Texas. He had built the firm from nothing. That was the story he told at every dinner party, every investor lunch, every holiday gathering where he needed to remind the room that everything in it existed because of him. And maybe it was true. I had no reason to doubt it when I was 8 years old, sitting on the floor outside his home office, waiting for him to finish a call so he could read me a bedtime story. He never did finish that call. I fell asleep in the hallway and woke up to my mother carrying me to bed, whispering that Daddy was very busy, that Daddy worked very hard, that someday I would understand. I understood earlier than she expected. I was the second child. The one who arrived 14 months after my brother and immediately became the footnote in a story that had already been written. My brother Tate was my father's first draft of a perfect heir, tall, confident, and just careless enough with money to seem like he belonged to it. He had my father's jawline and my father's habit of walking into rooms like he owned them, which, eventually, he was meant to. I had my mother's quieter face and a tendency to read the fine print on everything, which my father once called a character flaw at a Thanksgiving table with 11 people listening. "You overthink," he told me. "Business is about instinct." I was 23 and had just caught a $340,000 error in a vendor contract that his senior analyst had missed. I did not point that out at the table. I just refilled my wine and smiled. That was the year I started working officially at Whitmore Capital. I had interned there every summer since I was 16, fetching coffee and organizing files and learning, always learning, because learning was the only currency I had. I did not have Tate's easy charm. I did not have his ability to walk into a meeting, say almost nothing of substance, and leave with people feeling good about him. What I had was a finance degree from UT Austin, a minor in data analytics, and an obsessive need to understand how systems broke down before they actually did. My father gave me a junior analyst position. He gave Tate a VP title and a corner office 2 floors below his own. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I would prove it through the work, that the numbers would speak for themselves, that a man who built a firm from scratch would eventually see the value in someone who understood the numbers better than anyone else in the building. I told myself a lot of things in those years. The firm specialized in private equity and real estate investment. We had a portfolio of commercial properties across the Southwest, a handful of manufacturing acquisitions that my father had been quietly proud of, and a growing presence in infrastructure deals. Toll roads, utility contracts, that kind of thing. The infrastructure division was what I had spent the last 3 years quietly rebuilding from the inside. The data had been a disaster when I first dug into it. Depreciation schedules that had not been updated in 6 years. Maintenance cost projections that bore no relationship to actual spend. 3 assets that were technically underwater but had been carried on the books at inflated values, because no one had wanted to be the person to tell my father. I fixed it. Quietly, methodically, without making anyone feel embarrassed about the mess they had made. I wrote a new valuation framework, retrained the junior analysts on the infrastructure team, and over 18 months, turned what had been our weakest division into the one generating the most reliable cash flow. My father acknowledged this at a staff meeting by saying the infrastructure numbers were looking better lately, and moving on to the next agenda item. Tate got a bonus that quarter for strategic vision. That was also the year I met my husband. He came into my life the way genuinely good things usually do, sideways, when I was not looking for anything. We met at a friend's backyard barbecue in Plano on a Saturday in July that was approximately the temperature of the sun. He was standing near the cooler arguing good-naturedly with the host about college football. And he handed me a cold drink without me asking, because he had noticed I had been standing there for 30 seconds and no one else had. His name was Garrett. He was a high school history teacher at a public school in Mesquite, drove a 2018 Civic with a broken passenger side window regulator, and owned exactly one blazer that he wore to every occasion requiring a blazer. My father met him 6 months later and smiled the way people smile when they are working very hard at being polite. "A teacher," he said afterward, when it was just the 2 of us. "That's admirable." The word admirable, in my father's mouth, meant something that other people do. I knew what was coming. I had watched him use money as a leash my entire life. With my mother, with vendors, with anyone who needed something from him. The leash had always been long enough that you forgot it was there, until you tried to walk in a direction he had not approved. I had my own savings, built carefully over 3 years of living below my salary, and investing in index funds and a small rental property I had bought with a friend in Fort Worth. I was not helpless. But I was also still on the company health plan and still had my name on a family investment account that my father had set up when I turned 18 and that I had never thought to disentangle myself from, because it had never felt urgent. That was my mistake. Garrett proposed on a Tuesday evening in February, on the couch in my apartment, during a rerun of a nature documentary. No restaurant, no audience, no production. He had a ring he had saved for quietly, and a speech that lasted maybe 90 seconds and made me cry anyway. We told my mother first. She held my hands and teared up and said she had liked him from the beginning, which was true. We told my father at Sunday dinner. He listened, he set down his fork. He looked at Garrett and then at me and said he would like to have a conversation with me privately, which was his way of saying this conversation is about to go badly and I do not want a witness. We had that conversation in his study. He told me he was concerned. He told me that Garrett was a fine person, but that I was going to find, over time, that having a partner who did not match my trajectory would create friction. He told me that he had worked too hard to build something lasting to watch it become complicated by choices that were, in his opinion, short-sighted. I asked him what he meant by complicated. He told me he had been thinking about the firm's succession structure, that Tate was being positioned for the CEO role which I had known, that my own role going forward would depend on my being, as he put it, fully aligned with the direction the firm was taking. I asked him if he was saying that who I married would affect my position at his company. He said he was saying that family unity mattered in a family business. I said that was not an answer. He said some things did not need to be spelled out. I went home and sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I could drive. Then I called Garrett and told him everything, and he listened without interrupting, and when I was done he said, "Okay." That was the thing about plan. He did not catastrophize. He did not make it about himself. He just started thinking about what came next. We got married in October, a small ceremony at a venue in the hill country, 53 guests, wildflowers, my best friend from college as my maid of honor. It was the best day of my adult life. My father attended. He gave a toast that was technically warm and personally empty, and he danced with me to a song my mother had picked, because she knew he would not have picked anything. He was gracious on the surface the way he had always been gracious on the surface. 3 weeks after the wedding, he called me into his office and told me my position at Whitmore Capital was being restructured. The infrastructure division which I had built was being folded under Tate's portfolio. My new role would be in client relations, essentially a lateral move dressed as a promotion, the kind of thing that looks fine on paper and means nothing in practice. My salary was unchanged, my actual influence was gone. He also told me, in that same meeting, that he was making adjustments to the family investment account. His name was on the account as a co-trustee, something I had never thought to look closely at when I was 22 and grateful for the gesture. He was not removing my assets. He was simply restructuring the management, he said. I would need to work with his attorney on the transition. I left that meeting and went directly to the private office of a family law and estate attorney I had researched the week before. Because I had seen it coming, not the exact shape of it but enough. I had started preparing 3 months before the wedding quietly, the way I had always done everything quietly. I had moved my personal savings into accounts in my name alone. I had talked to a financial advisor. I had made sure my rental property in Fort Worth was titled correctly. What I had not done was quit. Not yet. I spent 8 more months at Whitmore Capital in the client relations role, learning exactly which clients trusted the firm and why, which relationships were genuinely strong and which were held together by my father's personality and nothing more structural. I was very good at client relations. I had always been good with people. I had just spent 10 years in a building where that skill was valued less than Tate's ability to play golf with investors. During those 8 months, I also wrote a business plan. Garrett and I had been talking, in the way couples talk late at night when they are being honest with each other, about what I actually wanted, not what I had been trying to prove, not what I thought I owed my father for the years of training. What I wanted, the answer, when I stopped qualifying it was simple. I wanted to build something that was mine. Something where the infrastructure division did not get handed to someone else. Something where the numbers I fixed were the numbers that got the credit. I shared the plan with exactly 2 people outside our household. One was my college roommate who was now a CPA, and who spent a weekend going through my projections and came back with 17 pages of notes, all useful. The other was a woman I had met at a commercial real estate conference in Austin 2 years earlier, a managing partner at a mid-size investment firm in Houston named Sinclair Advisory. She and I had stayed in touch. She was the kind of person who remembered what you said at your first meeting and brought it up again when it became relevant. When I showed her my plan, she read it in one sitting, asked 6 precise questions, and then told me she might know some people who would want to talk. My mother found out I was leaving before I gave my formal notice, because my mother had always had an instinct for undercurrents in that household. She called me on a Sunday and asked, without preamble, if I was planning something. I told her yes. I told her I was starting my own firm. I did not tell her the name of my first investor meeting, or the name of the Houston contact, or any detail that could travel somewhere I did not want it to go. I loved my mother. I also knew she told my father things she did not mean to tell him, because she had lived inside his orbit for 31 years, and some information just moved in that direction by gravity. She asked me if I was sure. I said yes. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, I always thought the infrastructure work was yours. It was the closest she had ever come to saying what she actually saw. I gave 4 weeks' notice in January. My father received it with no visible reaction, which meant the reaction was happening somewhere he did not want me to see it. He shook my hand at the end of our final meeting and told me he hoped it worked out, and I thanked him, and we both stood there in his 32nd floor office in downtown Dallas and did not say any of the things that were true. Tate stopped by my office an hour later and told me I was making a mistake. He was not unkind about it. He was just very certain, the way he was always certain about things he had not thought through fully. He had my father's confidence without my father's underlying work ethic, and it had never failed him yet because no one had ever made it fail. I packed my office in 2 cardboard boxes and carried them to my car myself. The first year of Aldridge Consulting, the firm I incorporated in Texas, named for my maternal grandmother who had run a bookkeeping business out of her house in Amarillo for 40 years, was the hardest year of my life and one of the best. Garrett was teaching full-time and had taken on a summer curriculum development project that paid a modest extra amount, and we were careful with money in a way that was actually clarifying. We knew exactly what we had. We knew exactly what we needed. There was no performance being maintained. I had 3 clients in the first 6 months. Small by any measure but serious clients, a commercial property owner in San Antonio who needed a portfolio restructuring analysis, a regional logistics company outside Fort Worth that was looking at 2 acquisitions, and a family office in Austin that had been burned by their previous advisor's projections and needed someone to rebuild their infrastructure valuations from the ground up. That last one felt like a gift. I understood infrastructure valuation the way some people understand a language they grew up speaking. By month 8, I had 6 clients and had brought on 1 part-time analyst. By month 14, I had hired 3 full-time people and moved out of the shared office space I had been renting in Irving into a proper suite in a building in uptown Dallas. My contact in Houston had made good on her mention of some people who might want to talk. 2 of those people had become meaningful referral sources. One had introduced me to a pension fund administrator looking for a boutique advisory firm for a specific infrastructure assessment project. The kind of project that, a year earlier, would have walked through the front door of Whitmore Capital and been handed to the division I had built and then been taken from me. I did not pitch against my father's firm for that contract. I did not need to. They were not in the room. What I did not know during those 14 months was what was happening inside Whip Capital after I left. I was not watching. I was too busy to watch, and honestly, I had made a deliberate choice not to track it because I knew myself well enough to know that tracking it would pull my attention in a direction I could not afford. I found out through a client. A man who had been a Whitmore Capital investor for 11 years. His family had a long real estate relationship with my father going back to before I was at the firm, called me out of the blue on a Thursday afternoon in March, about 15 months after I had left. He said he had heard my name mentioned by a mutual contact, and that he was looking for a second opinion on some infrastructure valuations. He said he was concerned about the projections he had been given. He said some of the numbers looked familiar to him in a way he could not quite explain. I asked him to send me what he had. He did. I recognized the valuation framework immediately. It was mine. Not because I had left it behind, I had not. I had built it in my own muscle memory and rebuilt it for Aldridge using refined assumptions. But the structure was the same, and more importantly, the errors that had crept into it were recognizable to me, because I knew exactly where this methodology was vulnerable if the person using it did not understand why each assumption existed. Tate had been running the infrastructure division for 15 months. He had not changed the framework. He had also not understood it. 3 of the assets I had identified as problematic before I left, the ones I had been quietly working to revalue, were still being carried at numbers that would not survive an independent audit. The methodology had drifted. Assumptions that I had built in as conservative floors had been loosened, probably because loosening them made the quarterly reports look better. The maintenance cost projections had deteriorated again. I told the investor I could do an independent assessment. I was careful and I was ethical about it. I disclosed that I had previously worked at Whitmore Capital, that I had left on professional terms, and that if at any point he felt there was a conflict he should tell me, and I would refer him elsewhere. He said he wanted me anyway. He said he had checked my background and he knew who had actually built the infrastructure framework. I spent 3 weeks on that assessment. When I delivered it, I was precise and I was factual and I did not editorialize. The numbers said what they said. He thanked me and told me he needed to have some conversations with his attorneys and his accountant. He was not the kind of man who would let a finding like that sit without doing something about it. He was not the only investor who called. 2 more came in the following 6 weeks, both with some version of the same concern, both having heard my name through the same network of people who track these things quietly. I did the work for both of them on the same terms, careful, factual, ethical. Each time I disclosed my prior connection to the firm. Each time they said they wanted me anyway. I later heard through the professional network that exists in Dallas financial circles, whether you are paying attention to it or not, that Whitmore Capital had retained outside counsel to deal with investor concerns. That Tate had been put on what the firm characterized as a strategic leave while the situation was reviewed. That my father had held a series of meetings with key investors that had apparently not gone well. I did not feel triumphant when I heard this. I want to be honest about that, because the triumphant version of the story would be cleaner, and I do not think it is true. What I felt was something more complicated, a kind of tired recognition that the thing I had tried to prevent by doing the work carefully and quietly had happened anyway, just on a longer timeline, because I had been the person holding it together and then I had left. I also felt clear. For the first time in years, the situation was legible. The numbers were not someone else's numbers that I was managing around. They were my numbers, my methodology, my reputation, and I could stand in front of them without any performance attached. My father called me in May. I did not answer. He left a voicemail that was 3 minutes long and that I have listened to twice. The first minute was professional. He said he wanted to discuss some matters related to the firm and some recent assessments that had my name on them. The second minute shifted. He said he felt that what had happened was not how things should be between a father and a daughter. The third minute, the one I think he had not planned to record, was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he thought I had always been the sharper of the two, and that he had not handled things the way he should have, and that he hoped we could find a way to talk. I sat with that voicemail for a long time. I called him back on a Saturday morning. Garrett was in the backyard with our dog and the newspaper, which is a very Garrett thing to do with a Saturday morning. I sat at the kitchen table and dialed my father's number, and he picked up on the second ring. We talked for an hour and 20 minutes. It was not a reconciliation movie scene. It was 2 people who are related and complicated and hurt in different directions, trying to be honest with each other, which is much harder and much quieter than any movie would suggest. I told him what I had actually experienced in those years at the firm. He did not argue with my account of it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. He told me some things about his own history, his own father, the particular shape of pressure that had made him into someone who controlled things because releasing control had once cost him everything. I had not known the details of that story. It did not excuse anything, it did explain some things. We did not fix it in an hour and 20 minutes. But we started something that was honest in a way the previous 32 years had mostly not been. Tate called me 2 weeks later. He sounded, for the first time in my memory, uncertain. He had been given a diminished role as part of the firm's restructuring. He was not good at uncertainty. He had never had to be. I was not warm with him, but I was not cruel either. I told him he had the skills to figure it out if he was willing to actually look at what the work required, instead of assuming it would defer to him. He was quiet for a minute. Then he said, "You sound like Dad." I took that as a complicated compliment and said goodbye. Aldrich Consulting closed its second fiscal year with 11 full-time employees, a roster of 18 clients, and a reputation in the Dallas-Fort Worth infrastructure and real estate advisory space that I had built one correct number at a time. My contact in Houston had referred us to a regional infrastructure fund looking for an advisory partner on a long-term assessment engagement, the kind of engagement that anchors a firm's revenue in a meaningful way. We got the contract, we did the work correctly. My grandmother, the one the firm was named for, had kept her books by hand in a ledger she bought at a drugstore in Amarillo. She used to say that the truth of any business was in the numbers that no one was looking at, the overlooked ones, the line items that people skipped because they assumed someone else was watching them. I learned to look at those first. Garrett and I bought a house in the Lakewood neighborhood in East Dallas, a 1940s craftsman with a front porch that gets afternoon shade and a backyard that our dog has destroyed systematically and with great personal satisfaction. On Friday evenings when neither of us has to work, we sit on that porch, and Garrett drinks a beer and I drink iced tea, and we talk about nothing in particular, which is the most valuable thing I have in my life, and the thing I almost traded away for a corner office, 2 floors below a man who never read me that bedtime story. I do not need him to. I found out a long time ago how to put myself to bed.